how the people are doing. So, the interesting thing about this particular comparison, I actually shot this a while ago, but I never really got around to making it in time. Anyways, we're finally at that spot. So here's the deal. I understand the OnePlus 12, it is cost effective. That's the whole point behind it. I will keep that in mind. But as I'm critiquing and as I'm talking about each and every image and how one is maybe performing better than the other between these two phones, well, I'll not be constantly talking about the price, but do bear in mind that I do have the price tag in my head while I'm talking about it. I'm just talking about the images here. So, just disclaimer, just because I don't mention it doesn't mean I'm not considering it. Now, with that said though, it's an interesting, let's say, challenge for the X100 Ultra because it really does need to prove its worth. OnePlus, on the other hand, just needs to show that it can handle itself well enough to justify the way lower price tag. Alright, jumping right in with the main cameras. Now here's the deal. The OnePlus does not provide a good number of color profile options like the X100 Ultra. But here's also another thing to bear in mind. You see, I know the OnePlus 12 has a Hasselblad mode that you can use when you're using Master mode, which is essentially a Pro mode. Just a fancy term for a Pro mode. But look, here's the deal. I've used it plenty of times before. I don't know about anyone else's experience, but for me, it just hasn't been good enough. You see, it's simple. It doesn't really produce enough of a difference for me to even bother with it. Occasionally, by that I mean like 1 out of 7 or 8 images, I'd get like a lower saturation image with the Hasselblad mode. And to be honest, the regular color profile on the OnePlus 12 is already really good, as you'll see soon enough. So I just absolutely do not see a point in using the Hasselblad mode. It makes no sense. Now, there is one thing that I do enjoy about the OnePlus 12. It does give you a good amount of contrast. It's not particularly shy about it, and that's nice because I love high contrast. The X100, on the other hand, I think in part because it has textured mode, it goes for a very balanced approach. But I've also sometimes noticed, it's not very apparent in this comparison, but I have noticed that it can mess up with the highlight control, with the main camera at least. So that can happen, just bear in mind. So look, overall I do believe that you could not go wrong with either of these with the main cameras at least. But that's actually not good news for the X100 Ultra because it needs to prove itself, naturally, with the price gap. So it's not really doing that at the moment, at least. There's gonna be other instances, of course, we'll get to that. But at the moment at least, it's kind of falling behind because of that very reason, because of the fact that the OnePlus is just keeping up. That's all the OnePlus needs to do after all. Yes, it does have more color options, but that's not enough. And then with the ultra-wide cameras, so it's basically the exact same story that I've been telling with the main camera. You're not gonna have any issues on either, but there are gonna be certain instances when the dynamic range, unlike with the main camera, is actually going to be better on the X100 Ultra because for some reason the main camera's highlight control is not as good as even the X100 Ultra's ultra-wide camera. Don't understand the reasoning behind it, so don't even ask. It makes no proper logical sense, and it is pretty evident in some of these images here because you do see that the OnePlus's highlight control is not quite as nice, but it does give you more shadow details, so I think that kind of makes up for it. And then of course, we gotta talk about the macro mode. So, we get the ultra-wide macros, which is fine. It's not particularly good. You can't get very close on either of these phones. There are way better ultra-wide macros out there. With the 3x on the OnePlus and the 3.7x on the X100, the X100 seems to be capable of giving us a much better close-up as opposed to the OnePlus, because that's not even a close-up at this point. And as you would expect, when you do use a sensor crop, you're gonna get a much better and much more close-up macro shot on the X100 Ultra, and that's a phenomenal shot that you're getting on the X100. It is incredible in the way it looks because a telephoto macro is not going to give you any distortion. It's going to give you a lot of depth of field, and it just looks stunning. To my eyes, that's the way to go in terms of macro photography. I prefer telephoto macros way more than ultrawides. But then the 2x sensor crop. Now the OnePlus, it doesn't have a particularly good 2x sensor crop. It's just the way it goes. The X100, on the other hand, in terms of detail preservation, I think the X100 Ultra is the best bloody phone that I've ever used. And as you can probably tell, it does tend to go above and beyond in terms of detail preservation. This is going to be some of the best 2x sensor crop action that you're going to see. The OnePlus, it doesn't really even stand a chance. It has got a lot of processing, basically not even in the same league in terms of the details. But then, what about the telephoto camera? So previously, the OnePlus 12 had one of the highest quality telephoto camera that I'd ever used. But then the X100 Ultra came in, and this, I think it's gonna take the crown here. Both the hardware and the software, they are so perfectly synchronized, you're probably not gonna get anything better than this. Now, in this particular case, I'd say that it is a very difficult subject because there's not a lot of contrast to work with, and usually good contrast will produce really nice and evident looking details. But even then, I can very easily tell, at least on a large screen, that the X100 Ultra's detail preservation is significantly better, and most importantly, it does not have nearly as much processing. Then of course we have 5x, and neither of these have any more optical zoom. And as you can tell, the OnePlus 12's 3x is a very good and high quality sensor that it has. And so is the X100, so at 5x you're not gonna see a huge difference. Then how about 10x? It's very similar. Of course, the subject is not a very easy one given that there's not a whole lot of contrast to work with, but both are performing really well. I'm not seeing a whole bunch of problems or artifacting or anything of the sort. Both are maintaining a good level of detail. But then at 30x, I'd say this is exactly where you're gonna see a good amount of difference, as you can probably tell. It's not just the dynamic range that is being preserved slightly better, but the overall details in every bit of the image is so much higher as opposed to the OnePlus 12 that it is a staggering thing to see. Now, I said this in the beginning of the video, I'll say it again. I'm not considering the price tag at the moment. I will when I conclude about this whole thing. Look, there are obviously going to be advantages on the X100 Ultra. That's the whole point of the extra bit of money that they're charging, especially in terms of the cameras. But now let's check out high res, especially with the main camera. I do want to point one thing out though. The warmth that you see on the X100 Ultra, it is perfectly accurate, and that is absolutely not the case on the OnePlus 12. And when you crop in, okay, that's I didn't expect it to be this much of a difference between the two. Like that, it doesn't even look like the OnePlus is using high res. You see, that this is what I'm talking about when I say that the X100 Ultra's detail preservation is top of the line. There's really nothing else quite like it. But then what about the ultra wide camera? And once again, we are seeing that significant decrease in the warmth in the scene. Like, this is much more natural looking on the X100 Ultra as opposed to whatever the OnePlus 12 is doing. It's removing all the sunset warmth. Like, that's the whole point when shooting it at that point in time. Anywho, let's crop all the way in, and well, look at that. This time the OnePlus 12, it has similar level of detail, maybe slightly higher detail as opposed to the X100 Ultra. Very minor difference, but I do think that there is just a tiny pinch less processing on the OnePlus 12. Now, you might not even be able to see this difference. It is very minor. But then moving right along to what I think is going to be the most interesting one out of all these high-res shots, the telephoto high-res. So, the OnePlus 12, as I mentioned previously, it does have a really good sensor, and it is used fairly well. But then the X100 Ultra comes in with one of the highest quality sensors that I've ever seen. And coupled with that, the fact that it has not just 200 megapixels, but also bin down 50 megapixel mode, which is the most useful, obviously, and that's the one you're looking at. I did also have a 200 megapixel version of this, but it's not in this comparison. Can you guess why? Well, let me zoom in and show you. 50 megapixels is able to produce this kind of an image. Now, I do see some motion blur on the OnePlus 12, which is very odd because at this point in time, there should not be any motion blur. I don't know why it happened. I did take multiple shots and I saw this similar kind of weird blur. I feel like that's somehow a temporal artifact of some kind. I'm not really sure, but it is happening on the OnePlus over multiple images. And there's no such issue on the X100 Ultra, but just the difference in detail. At 200 megapixels, the only difference you would see is slightly less processing and even more detail. At this point in time, it should be more than obvious that the X100 Ultra is pulling ahead by an absolute mile, at least in terms of detail preservation and high res and zoom, because that's where it really shines. But that's not the only thing that you care about, right? You probably care a lot about selfies, portraits, and night mode. That's exactly what we're going to get into. So, starting off with selfies, and this is very awkward little thing that I've noticed with the X100 Ultra. It can sometimes blow out highlights significantly. It can happen out of the blue. It can happen for no good reason whatsoever, and it is genuinely an inconsistency in the processing. I don't know why it happens, but it does, and it's important that you know about it. But the one definitively good thing about the X100 Ultra is that it can maintain skin tones with near perfection. It has its issues. It can sometimes maybe muddy up the details, other times it'll blow out highlights, but the skin tone preservation is one of the absolute best that you're gonna get. The skin tone consistency, that is. Because the skin tones looking kinda desaturated and not particularly appealing is definitely an issue that I'm noticing on the OnePlus 12. So that's definitely something that the OnePlus needs to improve. However, overall, I think that because of the general accuracy with the highlights and the fact that it doesn't really have to struggle with any of it, I think the OnePlus still takes a slight lead. Of course, the price tag does get to play a slight role here because it is very close in terms of both the pros and cons between these two. So the price tag kind of gives it a nudge for the OnePlus. And then of course we have portrait mode. Now, you see, portrait mode is something that I feel is basically some of the best that you can get from Vivo in general, not just the X100 Ultra. A lot of the Vivo devices that I've used over the years, they have had some of the best portrait modes in the industry at their particular times, of course. So it really doesn't surprise me that the X100 Ultra is obscenely consistent, has incredible edge detection, and the skin tones, just like with the selfies, they tend to be stunning to say the very least. And the dynamic range. Unlike the regular main camera shots, which are supposed to be even easier for processing, for some odd reason enough, it can actually turn out to be really good on the X100 Ultra. On top of all that, it also gives you a metric ton of options in terms of how you want your image to look, both in terms of the regular color profiles that you have. There's like 10 different ones and very stylish ones too. There's also about 100 different bokeh types that you can have. It works out really well. And then finally, night portraits. You see, it should be more than obvious at this point that the X100 Ultra does have stunning night portraits, just like regular portraits. Portrait mode in general, some of the absolute best as you can get. Exactly what I said at the beginning. The OnePlus 12 has been keeping up fairly well though, because as you may have noticed, there have been some desaturations in the skin tones and so on and so forth basically, but it's not particularly bad and definitely not unusable or anything in that ballpark. And then regular night mode. Now you see, this is going to be interesting, for me at least, because I think the OnePlus 12 is going to turn out to be better, because I personally prefer darker night shots. Darker night skies, high contrast, because it really captures the essence of nighttime. And the X100 Ultra does the exact opposite. It has good night mode, like technically speaking it has some of the best night mode, but for me it really does not work. I really want my night mode shots to look like they were taken at night and they maintain that look of nighttime. That's important to me personally. It may not be important to you, so use your own discretion there. But look, at this point it should be obvious that both of these phones have a very different take on the night mode, because although the quality is very similar, the OnePlus 12 maintains the nighttime look, and that for me is much more worthwhile, because I don't want my night shots to look like they do on the X100 Ultra. It's good once again, but it does not work out for me. And the same is obviously true with the ultra-wide camera. I think the quality of the shot is maybe a pinch higher on the X100 Ultra, that is to say the level of detail is slightly higher on the X100 Ultra, but other than that, the overall look of the shot isn't quite as nice, especially with the night sky. When you're dealing with the night sky and it looks a little too grey and dull, that just really takes you out of it when you're shooting nighttime. And now, last but not least, we have zoom at night. Starting off with 2x, because let's be honest, the 2x difference between these two, at daytime at least, is massive, is significant. So what happens at night? Well, as it would turn out, we do get a bit of a bridge between the gap between these two phones, because it does appear that the OnePlus 12, yes, it does not have as much detail, naturally, but it also lacks a good bit of the overprocessing that we're seeing and the sharpening that we're seeing on the X100 Ultra. Then of course 3.7x versus a 3x, because let's face it, these two are possibly the highest quality sensors. Now at night, there's only one that can prevail. However, I do want to mention this. I think that there's something weird going on with the colors on the X100 Ultra. It doesn't appear to be particularly accurate as opposed to the OnePlus, which is accurate. Anywho, cropping all the way in, the detail preservation is definitely higher on the X100 Ultra, but I gotta say this, at night the difference between the two is not nearly as much as we saw with the daytime images. So naturally, it does go to show that the processing is what's actually helping the X100 Ultra out a lot. I'm not denying the fact that the sensor is out of this world, but the processing is definitely helping it out a lot. We should not discount that. It took a lot of hard work by a lot of people to get the processing to this stage, and I think they deserve credit for that regard, don't they? Alright, so that brings us to the end of this comparison. So here's the deal. I did mention that price will play a major role in determining which one's better. The OnePlus, because it's way low in price, it does just need to prove itself. We'll get to it, but you see, with the X100 Ultra in particular, you also got to consider the fact that you need to import this baby from China, so that adds a whole layer of complexity and crap that you need to deal with. But if you are determined enough to go through with it, I gotta say, the X100 Ultra is probably one of the best for photography that you're gonna get this year. It really is. There's not much else that can compete with it. It's not devoid of issues, obviously, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that For all that it offers, especially in the detail preservation side of things, there's really nothing else that can provide that to you. So it does have a certain uniqueness factor, especially with that 3.7x zoom. The absolute best telephoto camera that I've ever used, and the amount of software processing and the finesse behind the software processing that you have from Vivo, it really is something else. It's one of the best things that you can have. So keeping all that in mind, I think if you are really looking for the camera, the photography camera, then yeah, the X100 Ultra is the way to go. But if you want to save up a good amount of money and a good amount of hassle, well then the OnePlus 12 should be a slam dunk winner here, shouldn't it? There's definitely an audience for both, no doubt about that. I mean, if I had to pick one, I'd pick the X100 Ultra. I mean, I'm a camera nerd if anything at all, so it makes sense. And well, with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful. I'll see you guys soon enough with more. Cheers.